Good morning, everybody. My name is Naji Abiad. I'm really pleased to moderate this very interesting panel today at the very exciting times in the US. A panel assessing the American energy independence vis-a-vis the oil dominance of OPEC and OPEC Plus. We have today three prominent speakers, starting with Dr. Harold Zior, a non-resident fellow in energy and global oil in the Center of Energy Studies in Rice University's Baker Institute for Public Policy. Our second speaker is Dr. Justin Darjan, a senior visiting fellow at the Middle East Council on Global Affairs, specializing in the intersection of the Middle East energy markets, geopolitics, and climate change. And the third speaker is Ms. Rachel Ziemba, I hope I pronounce it well, founder of Ziemba Insights, a microeconomics and policy due diligence advisory firm. We start now with Dr. York, who shall talk mainly about the key component of President Trump's energy policy and then their implications on OPEC and on the Gulf Cooperation Council member states. Dr. York, you have 7 minutes, 7 to 8 minutes. Please be punctual. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much for inviting me. I think what I can do is talk that there's really kind of four components to President Trump's energy policy. The first one is, if you think back to his presidential campaign in 2024, he would clearly has the philosophy that cheap energy is a weapon against high inflation rates in the United States. The challenge that he's going to have around oil or gas prices as that weapon against inflation is that what is the sweet spot in the oil price that will keep the U.S. consumer happy, because he promised them cheap energy. He promised to reduce energy costs by 50% by the end of the first year of his term. And also a price at which the U.S. oil and gas industry continues to do exploration, development, and drilling and production. And that's turned out to be a bit of a sticking point for him. It'll probably become a reoccurring theme throughout my comments, is there just seems to be, there's a lot of policy uncertainty around exactly what the end state is of some of the things that he's doing. The second element of his energy policy is a return to the empowerment of oil and gas. And if you've noticed, since the election in November, the oil industry has been much more vocal and much less apologetic about its business and its continuous need to invest and the role that it plays in the economy. Now, there's a lot of discussion about how they want to be more active and more productive. But there's a difference between that rhetoric of what they want to do and then what the market realities allow them to do. And the main driver for investment remains the oil price. And so that goes back to that cheap energy as a weapon against inflation. It's good for consumers, but at some point prices get too low, and then it doesn't work for the producer's side. And then you create a supply-demand imbalance. And then I think sort of the third positive element, because I'm going to come back to something that his energy policy is not, is permitting reform. And I think that's finally, we're now in probably year 3 of the discussion, where there is consensus across the political spectrum in the United States that there needs to be dramatic reforms in the efficiency and the effectiveness of how regulations are promulgated, and in particular, how projects are permitted. And to give you an example of specific to the oil industry, the backlog of federal onshore permits has increased by over 110% during the Biden administration. Now, that sounds like a dramatically large slowdown in activity, but it's important to remember that federal lands only account for about 5 to 7% of U.S. oil production. So the backlog is not a positive from an activity standpoint, but from a volumetric standpoint, it really hasn't impacted onshore production very much. The bigger impact on permitting delays in the United States has really been in the offshore and in the Gulf of Mexico or the Gulf of America, depending on which term you want to use. Approval times for offshore permits increased by 12% overall, but for new wells, which is critical for growing and sustaining production in the offshore resource base, those permit times increased by 70% during the Biden administration. So although there was still leases that they were required to hold by court order, and they were executing these lease sales, in the background, there was a slowdown at the rate at which they permitted the wells from those leases. And as a result, we've actually seen we've seen the Gulf of Mexico or Gulf of America, we've seen offshore growth struggle in the United States for the last 4 years. That's going to be, probably where we might see the biggest change in the oil industry. But overall, the biggest issue for all forms of energy, and this is where we get the political consensus, is around infrastructure permit approvals, pipelines, transmission lines, storage facilities. Every energy source is now facing some sort of infrastructure bottleneck, and that's preventing them, assets from coming into, commissioning and going into service. And there is a universal view that we need to reform that infrastructure permitting process. And he's made that a big part of his campaign, and that goes back to his lowering energy costs, because one of the ways you lower energy costs is by bringing new supply to market, and you can't bring that new supply to market unless the infrastructure is in place to allow that energy to reach to consumers. Now, what is not in the part of his policy is that this is not an end to the energy transition in the U.S. It's rather simplistic to assume that because President Trump is going to emphasize traditional energy sources, that means he's going to force the country to make a U-turn on the energy transition investments. And the reason why that's a bit naive is because many of the renewable energy requirements and a lot of the renewable energy capacity we see being added in the United States is stemming from state, not federal regulations. So those state regulations aren't really changing. And as long as they don't reverse course, there's going to be this continued activity and this continued drive in the renewable end. Now, there are some places where the Inflation Reduction Act or the IRA has provided federal incentives, and we have seen some accelerations. But I don't think you're going to see an entire repeal of that legislation, and mostly because a lot of the investment that's taken place since the IRA was passed in August of 2022 has been in the states that President Trump won in the 2024 election. And so it's unlikely politically that he's going to want to unwind the benefits that those states are receiving from those incentives. What I think we will see is some rationalization and more targeted incentives that are coming. I think there is a political acceptance across the political spectrum. I think there are some incentives that are palatable, like carbon capture credits and the hydrogen tax credits. I think those will remain. And then for the sake of political compromise, I think we'll see some of the other incentives that were in the IRA will start to fade away. Probably the most notable will be the EV tax credits. And the reason why the EV tax credits are likely to go away is because, quite frankly, they just weren't being used. During the time that we had the IRA was in place over the last 2.5 years, there's been about 3 million electric vehicles sold in the US, but less than 100,000 of those vehicles have qualified for the tax credit. So I think we'll see that go away. And I guess we'll get into a bit more about what this means about energy independence. But let me just close by making a comment that I think the biggest hindrance to Trump's energy policy right now is the uncertainty around it. We just saw in the Dallas Federal Reserve Bank released a survey yesterday, and a lot of the comments among energy producers and midstream companies was that the mercurial tariff policy that he's put in place has just introduced a lot of uncertainty around their planning. And without planning, they can't make investments. Without those investments, they can't grow energy supply. Without growing energy supply, you can't put downward pressure on energy costs like he's promised the consumers. I think that's probably the big issue right now within the industry is, the craving for policy certainty from the administration.
Dr. York, thank you so much for your interesting insight. Now we will go to our second speaker, Dr. Darjan, who aims to talk about the interaction between the US, Saudi, and Russian oil policies. Dr. Yarjan, you have also 7 minutes, please, for your talk. Thank you so much.
Great. Thank you very much. And I appreciate the opportunity to address all of you today. I think one thing that I would like to impress upon everyone is that we are at an inflection point. So there are three dynamics that we're seeing at the moment. We're seeing an acceleration of energy nationalism, which is occurring, not just in the US, but we're also seeing it arise in other areas. And we're also seeing a type of rollback of climate-oriented policies, regulations, and then, of course, a revival of hydrocarbon production expansion, more or less. So for the Gulf countries, what they must do is navigate this with tactical acuity and strategic restraints. So with the American First policy that is dominating right now, this is not merely domestic. What we're seeing is that this is reverberating across the arteries of global oil diplomacy. Now, I would say that the lessons of 2020, they were quite significant in terms of how Russia and Saudi Arabia perceived it. Saudi Arabia perceived that market share power is not merely a structural issue of supply and demand, but what they recognize is that it requires a type of choreography across geopolitical cycles. Now, in terms of Russia, Russia recognized that its leverage has limits without any type of sustainable price floor or a type of a strategic, or excuse me, like a structural flexibility. So as a result, we are seeing a transactional, the rise of a transactional convergence across the board. And both sides, Russia and Saudi Arabia, they recognize that they can no longer engage in zero-sum standoffs, that it is not for the benefit of anyone. And indeed, this was not the first standoff between Russia or in the form of the Soviet Union and then Saudi Arabia. The 1986 price collapse, oil price collapse, this was extremely significant, and many people think that this played a role in the ultimate dissolution of the Soviet Union. And also, of course, the Soviet Union was engaged in overreach in Afghanistan, and also the fiscal pressures of attempting to keep up with American rearmament during the Reagan administration. So I would say that these echoes were heard, actually, even if faintly, during the 2020 standoff. So what I see is that President Trump's second term, I mean, this has the aspect of attempting to reduce domestic gasoline prices, of course. And then again, as I mentioned, we're seeing a regulatory rollback for various ESG and climate-oriented policies, LNG expansion. And then also, and I think that this is quite critical, we're seeing the how can I say, the combining of hydrocarbons and foreign policy. So with the Trump administration's statements that it would launch tariffs, or that it would implement tariffs against many of its trading partners, actually it has been successful in many cases. We can see that with multi-billion-dollar investments that have been announced by many multinationals. And then also some of the trading partners of the U.S. have indicated that they will invest quite significantly in U.S. hydrocarbon assets and also purchase American LNG. And we see this happening with Korea. Now, what does this mean for the Gulf? In particular, Qatar. Qatar is concerned that the U.S. is going to pull away some of its traditional customers. So I can get into that a bit later. But again, I would like to stress that the U.S. is not the only jurisdiction which is implementing or threatening to implement trade restrictions as it relates to the energy sector. The European Union has climate-related trade restrictions that it might expand in the future. If you look at CBAM, for instance, carbon border adjustment mechanism, and then also methane regulations and other regulations that impose trade restrictions or will impose trade restrictions upon exports, hydrocarbon exports from the Gulf. So I just want to make clear that the U.S. is not the only jurisdiction that is implementing that. But for the outlook moving forward for OPEC Plus, I see in the short term, we will witness tighter policy coordination, which is a hedge against U.S. policies. Medium term, I would see that there are going to be divergent strategies between many of the OPEC Plus countries, in particular Russia and Saudi Arabia, as they pursue regional hedging, so to speak, in particular with the GCC. And then more long-term, there's going to be renewed urgency to further entrench at macroeconomic diversification to create alternative revenue streams. And this is especially the case in the GCC. But the Gulf states are adapting. For instance, the Saudi Arabia of LNG, Qatar, we are seeing that it is gearing up for quite significant price war globally. So it is doubling its LNG production by expecting to reach that, I think, 142 million tons per year by 2030. Saudi Arabia is quietly preparing for quote unquote a post-oil future. So it is leveraging Aramco's massive arsenal of capital to invest in assets globally. And the United Arab Emirates, the UAE, is also seeking a hedge via renewable energy investments, nuclear, and also climate diplomacy. So just to kind of tie everything up now, and I think this is very interesting, we are witnessing the age of climate geopolitics. So potentially what could arise from the hydrocarbon maximalist policies of the Trump administration, it may give the Gulf states much more room to resist climate trade restrictions and carbon border adjustment pressures from the EU and other jurisdictions. And we may see, and it could be quite likely, the emergence of a carbon counter coalition. And this is indeed not out of the question. And I end here. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much for your enticing comments. Let us move to the last but not least speaker, Mrs. Diemba, who will address us now about the impacts of the US energy policies on the economics of the 6 member countries of the Gulf Cooperation Council. Mrs. Diemba, you have another 7 minutes, please. Thank you so much.
Administration policies, Dr. York in particular, how there's a disconnect between Trump's focus on reducing the cost of energy and also building more energy capacity. We've also talked about how the shift has been back towards fossil fuels and the like. As well as nuclear policy, an area that's of interest to the GCC countries. So when thinking about the impact of these policies on the GCC, I think there's a couple of different areas. There's the impact on their economies and energy sector that stems from sort of U.S. production. There's also a question mark about the security environment and how that feeds through to the economic resilience. And finally, I think there are questions about how the U.S. environment reshapes GCC investment interests, all of which I think are quite relevant. The Trump administration interests in adding production and lower prices, those put more pressure on OPEC Plus perhaps, but only if the US is really able to add supplies. The sort of price environment we're in, as Dr. York mentioned, we're not seeing US oil producers likely to add a lot of production. Natural gas is a different story, but Qatar aside, the GCC is gas poor and would actually welcome the opportunity to add more supplies onto the market. We've seen ADNOC, for example, investing in US chemicals and gas production. That's something that could continue. But overall, we're looking at an environment where the tariff policy is arguably going to weigh on global growth. And we're seeing a shift in the type of growth that we're seeing out of China, all of which add up to sluggish demand growth for oil. And that's challenging both for the oil sectors of the GCC countries, but also the non-oil sector, because those other sectors benefit from the revenue that comes from the energy sector. That's still the case, and it's particularly it's contributing, for example, to a refocusing of which investments will go ahead in Saudi Arabia, for example. So this is a challenge, but there also are opportunities for the GCC countries as well. US sanctions policy, which we've alluded to, also is a challenge to be managed for the GCC producers. The administration is increasing pressure on Iran a little bit for now, maybe more in the future. They're also tightening up on Venezuela. This might create a little more market share for some of the GCC producers, but it also, in Iran's case, could come with some security risks. And finally, we're also seeing this question of dynamics in vis-a-vis Russia and what will happen as sanctions are enforced to a lesser extent. The reduction in the role, perhaps, of the shadow fleet that has been serving Iran, Russia, and Venezuela might actually be beneficial for the GCC. But going forward, this along with tariffs adds to the uncertainty and makes it somewhat difficult even for the state companies of the GCC to plan. Now, finally, I want to talk about GCC investment in the energy sector in the US. This is actually a potential plus for the GCC. The Trump team will probably be more open to investment in the US than the Biden team was. GCC investors might benefit from a proposed new CFIUS review process and streamlined environmental review. That, as Dr. York said, we haven't seen permitting reform yet, but we wait and see. GCC links with China, though, are a potential deterrent here. And also, of course, the question marks about the IRA incentives might limit the types of energy investments that the GCC investors can make. I continue to see those GCC links with China being maybe more of a deterrent for technology investments and less so perhaps in the energy sector. Overall, I think what we'll see going forward is GCC investors still looking for opportunities, but the broader challenges of the Trump administration shift probably will only increase the urgency for countries like Saudi Arabia to invest more at home in their non-energy sectors, and that's going to mean less capacity internationally. But this is a transactional time. It is one in which I think the Gulf countries see themselves relatively well positioned to try to take advantage of it. And I'm sure we'll talk more about how that might play out.
Oh, thank you so much. Thank you so much, Dr. Zimba, for first for your talks, second for being short and concise. Thank you so much.
I wanted to leave time for questions.
Thank you so much. Now I open the floor for questions and answers, but I use also my position to ask two questions to the panelists. The first is about, as Dr. Darjan said, about the LNG competition between the US and the Gulf, especially Qatar. Especially in an oversupply situation expected for the second half of this decade. The end result will be catastrophic for both. We will have a market share war, a negative impact on the prices, which will be bad for the investment, for the revenues, and everything. Uh, I don't know if there is any possible solution for this impasse, and maybe we can see, and this is what is noticed now, more and more in the Gulf countries. We will see more investment by the Gulf countries in LNG projects in the US itself. We saw it from Saudi Arabia, from Saudi Aramco, from ADNOC, similar to the golden path of Qatar and ExxonMobil. This could be a solution in the future. I would like to hear your view about that. My second question is about the impact of low oil price strategy implicitly adopted by Washington, D.C., on the economies of the Gulf states, knowing that some countries have or require a certain level of oil price in order to survive. This will be also bad for the not only the economies of these states, but also for the political survival of these states. Thank you. Maybe Dr. Darjan can start.
Hello.
Yes.
My mic is muted here.
We can hear you now.
Dr. Darjan.
Oh, hi. Hi. Can you hear me now?
Yes.
Oh, okay. Okay, great. My mic was muted. So those are very, very good questions that you asked. I would say that, and of course, as you correctly indicated, that there is room for competition, but also potential collaboration when we look at equity stakes that are being, let's say the Gulf states are investing in certain equity stakes in the U.S. But I would say for Qatar, this could potentially represent an existential challenge, because Qatar's economy depends quite significantly upon LNG exports. So we can see that Qatar has accepted the reality that there is going to be some type of market share competition in the future, and this is undeniable. Qatar outcompetes every single LNG producer when we look at price, or cost of production, excuse me. So Qatari LNG production is much less than the US, much less than Australia, and much less than any other emergent LNG producers. But the only thing that has been holding back Qatar thus far has been its adherence to its long-term contractual model. So we're starting to see pushback against the long-term contract, which is, for instance, from Korea, and then we're also seeing resistance from Europe, and then also other customers. So what's going to have to happen is that Qatar would have to be much more flexible in terms of its contractual model. And then if Qatar is able to do that, and also beginning to enter much more significantly in the spot market, then I would say that Qatar would be able to secure and be able to emerge quite dominant within the global LNG market. Now, at the same time, we see Qatar hedging its position by investment in natural gas assets overseas, and as you indicated, Saudi Arabia as well has been quite interested in investing in U.S. LNG assets. So we see mid-ocean, for instance, Saudi Arabia has purchased an equity stake in that. So the Gulf states are taking somewhat a very pragmatic view, but Qatar would have to be able to be much more flexible in terms of its overall LNG contractual model. But on the horizon, we're seeing that the tariffs from the Trump administration are starting to pull away some of Qatar's traditional customers. So Korea and Japan, they have announced that they are going to invest in the $44 billion Alaskan LNG project. This is quite significant. And if this happens to proceed apace, then we can see that Qatar might have difficulty in keeping many of its long-term customers. And then I believe your second question, did you want me to answer that now about the low price environment?
Yes.
Okay.
Or even Rashad can also give us her insights.
Yes. So, I mean, quite briefly, I'll just say, in terms of the low price environment, you correctly mentioned that the Gulf states, in particular Saudi Arabia, they have a break-even price, a budgetary break-even price, which means that the price that they must have for a barrel of oil in order to generate enough revenue to remain solvent. For Saudi Arabia, that has been increasing. Nearly every year. So on the eve of the American invasion of Iraq, the break-even price for Saudi Arabia was roughly, I believe, $20 to $30, something along those lines. Now it's plus 80. So that means that Saudi Arabia, as it's engaging in its massive economic diversification plans, mega projects, and so on and so forth, and as it's restructuring its subsidization, domestic subsidization policies, it has to have this revenue to be able to sustain that, and it can have a significant impact on socio-political stability moving forward. But we must not forget, though, that Saudi Arabia, in terms of its technical break-even price, which means that the price of oil that it must receive for its extraction of oil from its reservoirs for Aramco, that's lower than nearly anyone in the world. That's only about $5 to $10 perhaps per barrel. When you look at U.S. shale reserves, which are about 30 to 50, or you can even go higher. I mean, so if we look at technically, Saudi Arabia outproduces everyone, but because of its major expansionary projects, in particular with oil extraction and so on and so forth, it's going to have some issues. And I would just leave this food for thought. Domestic oil consumption in Saudi Arabia has been increasing. So its spare capacity is actually declining. It's actually reducing. So the Saudi Arabia of today is not the Saudi Arabia of 20 years ago. And spare capacity is what makes Saudi Arabia relevant in the international energy sector. So we may not see Saudi Arabia with ability to be able to leverage the international energy market if its domestic oil consumption continues to increase.
Dr. Dungeon, I fully agree, but don't forget that they are trying them really very hard to substitute oil by natural gas, especially for the power sector. Anyway,
they're trying. Yes, yeah. I agree.
Rachel, do you want to add something on this?
Sure, I'll add something just in addition to what I said in the other remarks, and I would agree with Professor Dargan's comment there at the end on, spare capacity perhaps evolving. I think right now, though, I'm less worried about the spare capacity just because so much is being kept off, sort of offline. But I think in the medium term, that is something we need to consider: how much spare capacity. I just think that the dynamics of the several levels of voluntary cuts that have been done in the last several years mean that that's probably not the same sort of near-term risk. Yes, Saudi Arabia is definitely a country that under weak, sort of weaker oil prices is challenged. Other non-GCC countries, places like Iraq in particular, are very vulnerable, and Iraq also very much in the crosshairs with maximum pressure on Iran. I think we'll see additional sort of challenges there. So Iraq is sort of facing it on multiple sides from a financing perspective. Saudi Arabia sort of has been leveraging its balance sheet in a variety of ways to, expand and tap the credit markets. And so the pace of new debt is quite astonishing. They are alone one of the largest issuers of hard currency debt in the emerging world last year, and on track to do it again this year. And so there is, I think, this risk as interest rates remain high. Right now, there's plenty of scope there, but it is, I think, a medium-term concern, and we're already seeing the authorities, as I said, sort of pull back. Other countries in the Gulf, the UAE and Qatar in particular, even Kuwait, more resilient to this lower price environment. The other factor we have to think about when we think about fiscal break-evens is to think about what the production level is. And so at the current price points, even if Saudi Arabia pumps a bit more, the fiscal position is still weak. But I think they're also looking around and saying at this price point, they might not face as much non-OPEC competition, right? And I take us back to some of, Dr. York's comments at our starting point today. So the dynamic, this increase in U.S. production or attempted is a concern, But I think, if anything, from the Gulf perspective, it's other aspects of US economic policy right now that might be even more of a concern. The investment uncertainty relating to tariffs, other things like that, that if anything, I would say are not great for global growth and global demand. Just to leave it on a positive note, I would also wonder to what extent, as the US is shunning solar and wind, whether there's maybe some opportunities to, as China dumps some of those products on the market. So try to have some positives and negatives in this uncertain time.
Good. Thank you so much. Dr. York, do you want to add something on it before moving to the next question?
Yeah, the only comment on is, I think, Doctor, I think both Rachel and Justin had got this, made some really excellent points. The only thing that I would add is that, there's the geopolitics of investing in different countries. So like Qatar or Saudi Arabia investing in gas in the US for geopolitical reasons. But there's also commercial strategic reasons to do that. I mean, LNG portfolio theory suggests that the optimal portfolio is one in which you have as many source locations as you have sink locations. So if you're a GCC gas producer and you're selling into Asia and in North Asia, South Asia, and into Europe, then you would like to have 3 supply sources you could draw from, and the US becomes one, or Canada. But the Americas becomes a place where you could create another one of those supply sources that helps you optimize commercially optimize your LNG portfolio, both from a shipping and a consumer security of supply standpoint for your customers.
By all means, if I can add, Dr. York, that there is another factor to be taken into consideration here, is that the Gulf LNG producer would like to have some capacity outside the Strait of Hormuz itself, which is also a very strategically oriented motivation. Anyway, let me move now to another question raised by Dr. Zafar, who asked, if the Ukraine war were to end, what is the chance of Russian hydrocarbons, especially gas, to fully return back to the market? And how would that affect demand for GCC hydrocarbons? The question is for all of you.
I'm happy to throw in a brief comment and then turn to others. So I think it depends very much the oil story and the gas story here. At the end of January, we had, and the point being, I think the challenge is much greater on the natural gas side for Qatar, for example, especially in the long term. Dr. Darjan sort of mentioned that Qatar would have to be more flexible about their term contracts. So might the consumers in that context. There's a lot of Russian piped gas that can't find a market. They are now buying LNG. They're thinking about LNG. They want to diversify. If there were to be a return of piped gas to Europe, which is the only place that can take more of it, then that would be sort of a game changer, I think, both for future purchases of Qatari LNG, but also US LNG, right? There is a real competition element between US and Russian LNG long term, which is, I think, why a lot of market actors have been a little puzzled by the Trump administration's focus on all the great economic cooperation potential, that line. But we'll see how that plays out. On the oil side, we have seen some Russian oil come offline. We've seen Russian products come offline, particularly after bombings of refineries by the Ukrainians. That may ease if this energy infrastructure ceasefire plays out. But on the oil side, the policy goal was always keep the oil on the market, but pay Russia less for it. So in a sense, what we might see is 2 things. One, a bit more Russian oil coming online, right? So Russia getting paid a bit more, but also that there would be less of this sort of discounting pressure from the shadow fleet coming through, and it might allow OPEC Plus to maintain a little more pricing pressure. But we're really talking about more like 500, sort of thousand, less than a million that's come offline. So there's not a lot more oil to come online. What I will say, I think echoing some things from the rest of the panel, is that it's been very important for Saudi Arabia and others to keep Russia in the OPEC Plus group, right? And to really sort of to try to avoid the kind of market share war that materialized in 2020. And so I think that's something that's going to be quite important going forward. And I'm sure one of the things talked about on the sidelines with all of these diplomatic meetings between the Russians, Americans, and Ukrainians in Riyadh and Jeddah.
Thank you so much. Dr. Darjan, any comments?
Yeah, just a couple comments. I think that the EU, even if there's a peace agreement between Ukraine and Russia tomorrow, the EU is never going to go back to being dependent on Russian natural gas. And I will put myself on the line and state that. One reason, of course, is political. Another reason is structural, because the EU has been able to expedite its decarbonization plans, energy efficiency, and so on, and been able to build up to a certain degree LNG import infrastructure with more investment planned. So as a result, I think that Russian gas is going to have to go east. And that's going to be a region of increased competition, of course, between the US, Australia, Qatar, and what have you. We see that China is leveraging its position as the customer of last resort for Russia. So it has been able to push Russia to accept lower prices. And then again, as has been mentioned by Rachel, we can see that for Russia, it's extremely important to try to find customers for its LNG and for its oil in order to fund its modernization plan. But we have to understand that modernization has been the key word of the Russian government since Peter the Great, and it hasn't been able to successfully do that for hundreds of years. I mean, so that is a problem. And then we're also seeing overall, and I think that this guides Russian strategic vision, is that there's a demographic decline in Russia, a very stark demographic decline. So if Russia is not able to entrench itself geopolitically from a position of strength, we can see perhaps for the next century, perhaps Russia is always going to be at let's say in a very subordinate position. And then also there's the issue of course, we've heard the allegations for many years of collusion between the Trump administration and Russia, although there hasn't really been evidence of that. But regardless, even if there are personal proclivities, let's say, of President Trump, let's say, for President Putin, however, structurally speaking, an American first policy cannot coexist with a Russia first policy. Structurally speaking. So when we see the increase in American hydrocarbons and also, let's say, President Trump attempting to position American LNG as being, let's say, without rivals internationally, this is going to put enormous pressure upon Russia, in particular with its LNG plans as well. And then even with potential competition between the US and Russia in the Arctic. And so those are pretty much the only points I'd like to state.
Thank you so much. Permit me here to say a word about the EU itself. We have to see to look which EU we are talking about. There are so many different points of view within the EU about Russian gas. You know that Hungary, Austria, and so on, they would love to import again Russian gas, which is much cheaper than US or other LNG. And this will be changing the whole picture. I believe also we have to see, as Rachel rightly said, we have to see the policy of Trump related to the possible competition between Russian gas and US LNG. They must be a fine-tuning here for the future. But anyway, the situation could change dramatically if part of the US gas export is paid for war compensation to Ukraine, for example, which has been in rumors lately. We have to wait and see. Anyway, Dr. York, do you have any comments on this?
The one comment I'll point out is on the oil side in Russia and the sanctions is the industry from the oil perspective. The fields are getting very mature and technically more complicated. I think a lot of people were surprised that we didn't see a dramatic drop off in production at the beginning of after the sanctions dropped after the Ukraine war. But I think but all of that sustained production were in existing fields that are maturing. And so what they've done is they're pulling future production forward. They're not adding new productive capacity. And they do sit on a lot of shale reserves, just like the U.S. does. But Russia, in a very real way, is like where the U.S. was in the 1990s, with a very rapidly maturing production base. And it's not mature production that's growing in the U.S., it's the shale production that's growing. Russia has that opportunity, but they've not been able to demonstrate either a willingness to adopt Western technology or the ability of Russian oil field services firms to develop the necessary technology. So I think, if you roll off the sanctions, you could get back to something about, I think Rachel's right. There's a limited volume that came offline, it comes back online. But you get towards the end of the decade and there becomes a new issue for Russia that's independent of the sanctions, which is, how are they going to develop and sustain production when they need to change to a completely new resource base that they don't have experience in, which would be shale?
Thank you so much. Good. Let me move for uh, another question by Matthew. We will talk about China. It seems this is very interesting now. The Chinese effect. Will there be an influence for China on the dynamics between the US and OPEC Plus in the coming years or two?
Yeah, so I can just pop in. I would say that China has been increasing its influence in the GCC. We have seen this since the Obama administration. So the U.S. has been somewhat withdrawing, creating a vacuum in the Middle East with the pivot towards China. But also there are internal dynamics as well. So with the Arab Spring, many of the traditional more conservative leaders in the Middle East, they feel that the Obama administration, through Arab leaders who are quite stalwart, let's say, and quite loyal in their view, partners with the U.S., threw them underneath the bus within just a very short period, even though that they were working with the U.S., collaborating for decades. So that soured many of the leaders on the U.S., and the view was that the U.S. is quite fickle, a fair weather friend, and that you cannot depend on them for the long term. Whereas if you look at, let's say, China, if you look at Russia, they tend not to care so much about international human rights and so on and so forth, at least a rhetoric of that, and they care more about sovereignty. So with that internal dynamic and then the external dynamic of the U.S. withdrawing from the Middle East, geopolitically, we can even say just in terms of rhetoric, and we see China beginning to enter. We're also seeing Chinese military bases actually within the region, which we had never even seen before, which isn't stated quite loudly, but we're actually seeing these bases are beginning to be constructed. So China is going to have quite a significant role within the GCC moving forward, in particular, the Strait of Hormuz. This is extremely important because there's a significant amount of oil that transits that area. And China's strategists are students of history. They recognize that the first oil embargo that was implemented in history was actually from the U.S. against Imperial Japan in order to choke it off from the necessary oil to fuel its war machine. So the Chinese know that the American Fifth Fleet, in case of any conflict, can quite quickly embargo it and choke off that critical chokehold. So China is going to be much more involved, trade, military, energy within the region. So I see that moving forward.
Thank you. Rachel, any comments from your side?
Yes, I think just adding to those very good comments from Justin, I think I would just add that China is obviously a key player both in the region, but also China as the major buyer of sanctioned crude and sanctioned fuel is an important player in this way. We've seen within the last week, or maybe it was earlier this week, I have trouble keeping track. So much is happening. So many announcements are coming fast and furious. But the U.S. talking about tariffs on purchasers of Venezuelan crude, 25% tariff, that effectively means China, because I think the other buyers would have already stopped because we've seen the sanctions waivers lifted. Could that happen with Iran? China is definitely the big buyer there. So I think that China is definitely a factor as a demander, as the largest consumer of many of the GCC countries. How willing they are to, for example, push back and use some of those military, sort of participate in any efforts to secure shipping lanes is still really an open question. But I think they're a factor. And then, of course, there's just a dynamic here where dynamics in the region play into overall US-China competition, not only in the ways that Justin just mentioned, but also as the US is looking to use leverage, economic leverage, to change policies, as I say, particularly on Iran. So I think it might not impact OPEC decisions directly, but OPEC is having to sort of think about what the demand dynamics are. But I think it is worth noting that the composition of demand in China for energy is shifting much more towards the power sector. And China is a much less petroleum-driven growth model than it used to be even a decade ago, and so that has its implications. It's still a very big demander, but I also think going forward we'll start to talk more about also where India fits in. Right, India has been a major sort of buyer of Russian crude and reducing the market share of some of the GCC countries. Will that start to shift if Russian oil is less discounted? Perhaps. So I think these big Asian buyers, they're of course going to be important in the next year, and even more so, I think, when we look beyond the next year.
Thank you. Dr. York?
Yeah, I think I want to leverage off of Rachel's comments about the changing demand profile in China. And, there's a growing view, and we'll see, but there's a growing view that transportation fuel in China will peak this year, next year, in the very, very near future. We actually saw a decline in diesel demand or gas oil demand last year. We think there'll be a recovery this year, very much, and a very slow growth in gasoline demand. Where the growth in oil demand is in China is in petrochemical feedstocks. And in that standpoint, the U.S. offers shale crude tends to set up better as a petrochemical feedstock than some of the middle gravity crudes that come out of the GCC. Now, you can address that through capital. You can make a middle grade crude a petrochemical feedstock, but you're going to have to invest more capital in the petrochemical plant in order to do that. But I wonder if this is inducing an uncertainty, is that we do know that the Chinese do feel that they are now overly exposed to U.S. ethane imports because they've built, because of the massive build out in petrochemical plants through the last decade. They now think they're overexposed to the U.S. But I think so there is this uncertainty, but it comes back to, I think, what Rachel was saying about India. Does India now become a key player for transportation fuels? And is that sort of now, does the GCC look at investing capital in China to create petrochemical feedstock facilities, or do they pivot into India if transportation fuel, if India becomes the next source of transportation fuel growth? I think so I kind of like Rachel points before, I think there's uncertainties around China's demand profile. But in those uncertainties for GCC countries, there might be opportunities. They just may not be in China.
Okay. Yeah, good. Thanks so much. I have 3 more questions. I will be fast. The first one, with the US reducing or dropping even their energy transition plans and clean energy plans, Do you think that this could affect the Gulf states' clean energy plans or projects?
I'm not sure that it changes the domestic projects that are already underway, or those that are, we see UAE entities among those investing quite heavily in renewable projects around the world in emerging economies, right? I think sort of some of those investments will go ahead, and that's a function of the cost of, the sort of the relative cost per kilowatt hour, and sort of especially in the power sector. I'm thinking about dynamics in Morocco and other dynamics. So, and domestically, to Justin's point earlier about Saudi Arabia's petroleum demand, one of the elements, was a broader policy is trying to find other sources, particularly for power demand and desalinization and the like, to avoid just drawing on a sort of more inefficient, sources. So I think some of the projects will go ahead. Now, they will likely face a lot less scrutiny from foreign financial institutions when they're issuing bonds and a variety of other issues. So I think that the global scrutiny, perhaps, of GCC sovereigns, GCC government, sort of energy companies might become a little less as you no longer have the sort of US pushing as much on the decarbonization front. I will say that most of the big sovereign investors in the Gulf are still holding to their desire to think about, sustainable projects. And, there's still a lot of interest in electric vehicle production domestically as part of advanced manufacturing. So I think it's a mixed story.
Justin, can you
Yeah.
comment?
Yeah, so I just built off of Rachel's statement. That's entirely on point. The Gulf states did not become environmentalists overnight. Okay, they were clear. They were clear. They did not become Greenpeace. Okay, there were clear strategic, macroeconomic strategic interests for them to embrace clean energy. And as Rachel pointed out, it's basically to reduce their domestic hydrocarbon demand. Up until about 2008, even the early 2010s, what we see is that Gulf natural gas demand, which is the principal linchpin of their industrialization plans. Since the 1990s or so, it was increasing by about 6 to 8% per annum. And by 2008, every single energy-rich country in the MENA region, with the exception of Qatar, was experiencing natural gas allocation shortfalls. So even Dubai had blackouts, for instance, and they didn't know how they could adequately allocate their natural gas in either to the retail sector or to the industrial sector, manufacturing, or what have you. So they were having a crisis. By 2012, we see a type of significant change. We see that they agreed to the Durban platform, and then they became quite proactive, if resistant, parties in international climate negotiations. But this merely, what they recognized by 2012 was that decarbonization equals a decline in domestic hydrocarbon usage, so you could capture that opportunity cost from supplying your domestic market by whatever the transfer price is. Let's say $1.20 per MMBtu for natural gas. Then you could sell that externally and reap the international market price, or for oil, they say transfer price is $5 to $10, and you could get the prevailing global oil price for that. So they recognize that. So I would say that domestically, they are not going to go back from their plans to decarbonize because that is something that's necessary. Although what we do see is, I think quite quickly, is what they call the green paradox. The green paradox is that when you have any international climate negotiations and regulatory structure that is born from that, it operates as an announced expropriation. So what does that mean? That means that it actually creates an incentive when you elongate, let's say, climate or decarbonization regulations at a global scale, such as with the climate treaties and what have you. Then the Gulf countries understand that we actually have to increase the tempo of our hydrocarbon extraction because it's quite soon going to become a stranded asset. So we can potentially see an increase in carbon emissions over the short to midterm due to the elongation of global climate change policy. So actually, you would have to, if you want to actually reduce climate change, or if you want to implement climate change mitigation, you should actually do it immediately, so that they don't feel that there's a depreciation of their main assets. So I think I end there. Thank you.
Yeah, you are right. On the long term, if everybody will go for clean energy, then what we will do with hydrocarbons in the Gulf? Then it is better for them to use them now or in the future. That's it. For what to go clean if we have so much oil and gas? You see. Anyway, Dr. York, any comments?
Yeah, the one comment is I think there might be an opportunity here for GCC countries in terms of partnering. I think you have U.S. firms that the energy transition isn't going to end in the U.S., but it might slow. But you have firms that have built capability, and they're going to want to keep those capabilities sharp. And so they may be looking for opportunities. They could be in GCC countries, or they could be GCC countries partnering with them, and you're going to someplace in Africa to do projects. But I think they're going to want to keep those capabilities sharp. I'm thinking specifically to wind, but to a greater extent in hydrogen. I think you've got some companies that are on the precipice of starting to actually do some commercial scale projects. If those projects don't happen in the US, they're going to be looking for some place to do hydrogen projects so they can prove out the technology and the techniques. So there could be opportunities here for more for partnerships than there would have been in the absence than without the pivot back to traditional fuels in the US.
Great point. Thanks. We are approaching our concluding time, but let me ask a final geopolitical question. Hans asked if the tensions in Bab el-Mandeb or the Red Sea can have any impacts on OPEC energy policies or on the US policies in general. Any comments from your side?
Well, I mean, I would just say that President Trump's policies of, let's say, encouraging more of its strategic allies to increase their security, to increase the burden of security investments and military investments and so on and so forth, that is expediting European coordination collaboration in the military and security sphere. So we're going to see a much more robust China militarily intervening within these areas. China has joined, for instance, the International Anti-Piracy Coalition, for instance, within the Red Sea. We're going to see a more robust European presence as well. And then these are going to play a role in terms of security and military diversification efforts as well within the GCC, so that they just don't rely upon the US as their as the only security partner. But frankly, I mean, for the near to midterm, there's no other military force that has the capability that the US does in terms of force projection, which is how your country is actually powerful. So I would say we would just see it like that. In terms of OPEC Plus overall, I don't really think it has so much of an impact, except for the short-term spikes in terms of the fear premium whenever the Houthis make an announcement or whenever they launch a missile or something along those lines.
Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
Rachel?
On that last point, I think, what we've seen in terms of the market response being relatively muted, even in the last, kind of couple days. I mean, oil prices moved up a little bit. I think that the sort of, half-life or sort of dynamics of that market risk has maybe dissipated, in part because even though it's much more costly, market actors have figured out some workarounds. Right now, that being said, I think there are sort of escalatory cycles and risks, especially if we could start seeing an acceleration of pressure not only in the Bab el-Mandeb, but also perhaps threats to tankers in the Strait of Hormuz. I'm not talking about a big sort of blockage, but if we see sort of military sort of attacks that lead to Iran Iranian or, Yemeni actors deciding to sort of break some of the Iran, Saudi Arabia agreements, then we might see sort of more, impact in that regard. But I do think the fact that there's still a lot of surplus capacity, that there's these sort of demand pictures, I don't think that this renewal necessarily changes OPEC policy that much. But we'll see. I think the sort of getting towards the spring and summer period, I think there's going to be some important diplomatic and geopolitical dynamics vis-a-vis, as I say, Iran in particular, but also, and I think that could be something to watch.
Good. Mr. York?
I think the only thing I'll add is that there's just the old financial adage that diversification is a good thing. So as you get more secured, as more countries take on more responsibility for their security, that just diversifies the security capabilities, which should create more stability. And you think about specifically around the Houthis in the Red Sea, is rather than them thinking they're taking on the US or the UK, you could get to a point, to Dr. Jean's note, it's down the road, right? But you could get to a point where you're not taking on one country, you're taking on a coalition of countries. And that might encourage people to not take steps that they have taken more recently, because they do think it's more of a bilateral, I'm taking on this one country. And I think they're half a world away. If I'm taking on a coalition of countries, I might be less inclined to be a provocateur.
Good. Thanks so much. We still have 5 minutes, and I would like to kindly ask each of the panelists to give a 1 to 2 minutes concluding remark, and then we will conclude. Let us start with Dr. York.
I think what I want to conclude is I think I'd like to convey the message that although we see a lot of change in, Trump is becoming much more domestically focused in terms of his energy policy. I don't think this means, I don't think this is the rise of energy independence in the US. And it depends on what you mean by it. If you mean that energy independence means the US imports no crude oil, no petroleum products, no natural gas, that's never going to happen. And the reason why it's not going to happen is because we have refineries that are configured to run heavy Canadian crude. Those deep conversion refineries cannot run on the light shale oil crude. And so we're going to be importing crude oil, that certain grades of crude oil to fit certain refinery configurations. Same thing is going to happen on the product side. We will import petroleum products into Europe and into the West Coast for the foreseeable future, if not forever, for logistics reasons. There just isn't the ability of the US to move product, to a sufficient product to those coastal regions, and they'll rely on international volumes in order to do it. If you think that energy independence means that I'm I'm an exporter or I'm balanced, well, the US is already there. The US has been a net exporter of hydrocarbons since 2020. So, and no sign that that's going to change in the foreseeable future. What I don't think the administration is going to get out of this, and you hear this term a little bit, I'm actually starting to hear it less, and it's energy dominance. And I think the notion that the United States has such a massive cost advantage over other energy producing countries in the world, that it can use energy as an economic or geopolitical weapon, I think we're going to see that's just not going to play out that way. The United States does have a cost advantage, like in LNG, and there will be markets where the United States will be able to take advantage of that. But could the United States actually have such a large cost advantage that they could dominate the global gas market? No, they just won't have the cost advantage or the volume to do that.
Thank you so much. Justin.
Yes, absolutely. And I just want to say that I agree with Skip right there. I mean, that the U.S. in terms of pound for cost, it really can outcompete many of the Middle Eastern producers. Although what I see, though, is not that the U.S. is using energy as a foreign policy tool, but also it's using foreign policy in order to encourage customers to purchase or invest in the U.S. And we're seeing this with Korea and Japan and so on. So we're going to see if this is successful for the midterm. But overall, see, or I'm starting to see, the beginning fractures of what was the Western dominated or oriented rule-based system since World War II. Okay, since 1945, and then also in particular, let's say after the dissolution of the Soviet Union, the New World Order. What we're seeing now is many of these fissures that are starting to arise. And my question, and this is something that we're going to see answered perhaps pretty soon, is that if the American hydrocarbon policies and, let's say, disinclination to pursue many climate-oriented agendas, if this proceeds as it is in its current form, and decarbonization retreats, at least from, let's say, the Atlantic side of the Western world order, whether the Gulf countries are going to use that to double down that policy space that is developing, right? Are they going to use that to double down on hydrocarbons, right? Or are they actually going to become arbiters, let's say, of a much more pluralistic and pragmatic energy order? Because what we see is that the Gulf countries, when you speak to them, when you hear many of the announcements, it is not the same as it was 15 years ago. What we're hearing is that they want to be strategic architects. They want a seat at the table. They want to build, they want their own input into, let's say, the global climate architecture or climate finance or so on and so forth. And just not the structural aspects of being the world's last resort for the supply of hydrocarbons. So we're going to see this answer fairly soon, whether they're actually going to be able to do so, whether they have a coherent policy to do so, and what's going to happen when the current incoherence of the global order starts to settle. We're going to see who's left standing.
Thanks so much. Rachel.
Yeah, I think that's right. And just to sort of pick up on the things that sort of Justin and Skip mentioned, we very much, I think, this question mark is not only about whether the U.S. has cost advantages, but also this balance between what price domestically people are willing to pay, right? I think one of the other challenges is there might be an absolute cost advantage, but you might not. But that concern about how LNG costs going up in the United States might limit that export potential. I think Justin is right that the U.S. is looking to involve LNG and other resources in potential trade negotiations. And maybe we'll see more of that in actuality after, next week we have a lot of new tariffs that are going to be introduced, and maybe that will be a window. The administration will start negotiating and saying maybe there's some sort of new agreement to come with some of these countries, and maybe natural gas is part of that. But in the United States, it's private companies that are doing these sort of projects. The government can provide, incentives. The government can do a variety of things. There can be tax credits, but this isn't a dynamic where it's a national part of the government balance sheet that is sort of running the hydrocarbon industry. So I think how that actually comes to pass remains to be seen. I think we've all highlight, and so I think as we look in the next months, some of the key signposts I'm watching for are what those negotiations look like, but also whether some of the big announcements from corporations, from countries in the Gulf, how much of the announcements actually make their way into investments. And that, I think, in the energy sector and beyond, and that I think is going to be reliant on whether, sort of how the bureaucratic processes work, whether there are real expedited and streamlined sort of elements. But I think we do see an environment where the rules are changing, and that there's some scope for producers in the Gulf to look for some new opportunities in that context. There's a shift within the energy sector of what's prioritized, but that countries that are really focused on supporting all of the above energy are probably going to be better positioned in this dynamic, as well as those that are a bit more flexible domestically, that don't have sort of too much sort of debt that's going to become a constraint on new investment. And that includes some of the countries in the Gulf. But I look forward to carrying on the conversation with you all.
Thank you so much. We reach the end of this panel. I would like really to extend my sincere thanks and again for our prominent panelists for the valuable contribution, for all the questions and comments. And with that, I would like to conclude the panel with many thanks for all of you. See you next time, inshallah.
Thank you very much.